مساء الخير أعزائي الحضور، أهلا بكم في احتفالية اليوم العالمي للغة العربية في مركز السلطان قابوس الثقافي. Good evening. I welcome you all to the World Arabic Language Day celebration at Sultan Qaboos Culture Center. Our panel discussion title for this year is Asian Arabic Civilizations, Great Treasures of Knowledge. In this event, we honor Oman's famous navigator, Ahmed ibn Majid, known as the Lion of the Sea for his great seafaring missions. Last month, Ahmed Majid has been added to the UNESCO list of globally influential personalities 600 years after his birth. Our panelist, Dr. Marina Talmachova, will be talking about Ibn Majid's work and accomplishments in her presentation. And before we start, I kindly ask our audience to write their questions in the panelists in the chat box. And now we start with our first panelist, Dr. Marina Talmachova. Her presentation title is Ahmed ibn Majid, the Omani navigator and poet. Dr. Talmachova is currently professor of history at Washington State University. She is also president emerita of the American University of Kuwait and past director of the Washington State University Asian Program. She is also an affiliate professor at the Middle East Center in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. Dr. Talmachova is an Arab civilization historian with a special interest in Islamic geography, pre-modern travel, and women's history. Her published research includes work on the Indian Ocean, Trans-Saharan Africa, and Central Asia. And Dr. Talmachova will take it from here. Welcome, Dr. Talmachova.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you for this introduction, and I'm glad to have other participants on this panel who will speak to the greatness of a civilization we all know and admire. This is a special year for Ahmed ibn Majid. Not only has he been added to the UNESCO list, but this particular year also notes the 50th anniversary of the first full English translation of his maritime encyclopedia, Kitab al-Fawaid, as it is known. And this is a very propitious moment to credit the outreach of knowledge, because this panel is all about knowledge, the outreach of knowledge, whether it is in the span of the Indian Ocean that is becoming so very much a focus of international discussion, and at the same time, the outreach of cultures. So I will try to cover 3 points in this presentation. One is the navigational outreach of Ahmed ibn Majid, who is a master, a lion, as he was called in the Arabic tradition, of navigation in the Indian Ocean specifically. Secondly, I will touch on the geographical scope of his knowledge. And thirdly, I will speak about the transmission of knowledge, something that brings us together on this panel. Ahmed Majid was born about 1430. You will find the dates of 1432 or 1434, and he died around 1500. We do not know exactly when. He has a long genealogy in his full name. He starts with the honorific Shahabuddin, but the only geographic attribute that he includes in that name is Najdi. And so he gives himself a wider scope, and also we have to say a land-based scope, even though he is primarily known as the navigator. One of the reasons why I myself became interested in Ahmed ibn Majid, besides my interest in Arabic geography, was that in a unique manuscript that is located in St. Petersburg, Russia. There are 3 of his poems. We are very lucky that we have the titles of about 40 of his works, of which just over 20 survive. Not many medieval authors have been that fortunate. And this particular unique manuscript is one of those that has 3 of his poems that were first translated into Russian, not surprisingly, because the manuscript is in St. Petersburg. And then, thanks to the Russian translation, they were translated into Portuguese, and later also some of them into English and French. Besides the Russian and Portuguese translation that was made from the Russian, not from the Arabic, there is no full translation of that poem. His encyclopedia is known very well thanks to the Tibbetts translation in particular, but also because it is a truly encyclopedic work. There is only one other poem that is widely known, and that is his Hawiya, which has been translated into French. Well, I will return to the connection with France later in my talk. But at this point, let me express my admiration for the amount of knowledge in one person who was not primarily an author. He was primarily a navigator, a working captain who started in his youth and continued to sail and to train sailors to his later years. One of the aspects of his public fame that still needs a rebuttal is that he was the pilot who led Vasco da Gama from Africa to India. This is simply not true. The well-wishers who wanted to connect the 2 traditions, that of Arabic navigators in the Indian Ocean, their craft, their knowledge of the ocean, and the European discovery expeditions, maybe meant well, but even they could not get over the fact that Vasco da Gama's pilot was named in the sources Gujarati. I'm sorry, Ahmed Majid would not have been available to Vasco da Gama, and he also deplores in one of the urjuzas of his Rajas poems that are in the St. Petersburg manuscript, he deplores the arrival of the foreigners to the area which is so well known and so dear to him. So putting this aside, let us take a look at what he has done for us to show his knowledge, because he is a mentor. He was mentored by his father, and he knows about his grandfather's knowledge of navigation, but he is not modest enough not to acknowledge that he knows more, and moreover, he is putting it out to the use of the others so that the tradition of knowledge can continue. It is thanks to the fact that his works are written. We do not have autographs. Maybe he dictated his works, but the fact is that so many of his works survive in transcription. It is thanks to that that we have the connections also to the later Arabic authors on navigation and to the Turkish Ottoman tradition, just at the time when navigation becomes global. This is a pivotal point in world history. So it is no surprise that UNESCO has added Ahmed Majid to the world list of influential individuals. He is an individual. This is not a team effort, but it is a family tradition. And he recognizes the other quote unquote lions of the sea that came before him. And although we do not have much information about professional navigators before his time, at least 1 out of 3 has been mentioned somewhere in the sources. And so we have the confirmation of not just the oral tradition, but of the learned tradition of Islamic, specifically Arab navigation in the Indian Ocean. I have to say that the Arabic has precedence here before Islamic era. And so even in the 5th century, it is recognized in other sources that the ships that maybe Greeks or Romans can sail on the Indian Ocean are not their own. There is some competition in the 5th, 6th century with Persia, pre-Islamic Persia, but we know that the Arabic tradition survives. And we have to say it is Arabic rather than Arab because of the language of expression. But at the same time, let us not think that Ahmed ibn Majid was self-centered or Arab-centered because he knows some Swahili words from Africa, and he knows some Asian words, and of course he knows a lot of place names because he describes the sailings all the way from East Africa to Indonesia. If that is not something that can impress you, I hope you will gain a greater admiration for classical Islamic culture as we progress. Because one of the aspects of the presence of Islam on the Indian Ocean is that the coastal areas either adopted Islam or were comfortable with Islamic presence. Even before Ahmed ibn Majid, we have other Arab travelers who left records of their own travels or left descriptions, geographical descriptions of areas around the Indian Ocean or tales of sailing on the Indian Ocean. And they all agree with the presence of Muslims in coastal areas and with their ability to interact with local cultures, even when the religion prevailing is not Islam. This is, I think, important to what I will emphasize later in the transmission of knowledge, because it is the information age we live in. And we have to think about information continuing from the ancient to the medieval to modern to contemporary. We are all part of that line of the transmission of knowledge. Ibn Majid's encyclopedia is divided into 8 chapters. And there he describes how the navigators watch the mansions of the moon, or how they need to know the wind seasons, or how they need to observe the coastal line, or how they need to observe the water. This is something that is very specific to the navigators. So there is no direct connection between Ahmed Majid's information and the vast knowledge of Arab geography, which deserves a panel in its own right. This is something that is not land travel. Even people like Marco Polo traveled to the Mongol Chinese Empire by land, but returned by sea. He sailed back to Europe. Ibn Battuta, probably the most famous of all of Arab travelers, traveled across the Maghreb, across many countries, including in Africa, all the way to India, and then possibly even visited China. He sailed back on the Indian Ocean. One of the reasons why this was done was, of course, the environment. The environmental knowledge that the navigators had to possess is impressive in its own right. And in our times, when we're all concerned about the environment, we are aware of how much enters into it. But at the same time, this is something that is not going to go away, because navigational skills require the pilot to know coastal lands, open ocean navigation, the monsoon seasons, and when it is safe to venture on a journey from India to Africa, or from Africa to Oman, or to India. This is one of the very important aspects of their knowledge. Let me touch a little bit on this transition of knowledge. The fact that the European expansion is happening at the very same time as Ahmed ibn Majid is at the top of his career will bring the two spheres of navigation, the Indian Ocean and Europe, close together. I will not touch on the consequences of that, but the important part for us is that the Portuguese navigators mention that Arab pilots had records by which they were guided. And indeed, in Arabic sources, we have mentions of dafatir, of the notebooks or charts that the pilots could consult. I have to say, for Ahmed ibn Majid's sake and for all those nameless pilots, that a lot of their knowledge was in oral form. It was not written. And this is the secret behind Ahmed ibn Majid being a poet. Verse is much easier to memorize than written prose. And so the information in Ahmed ibn Majid's encyclopedia was not the part that was memorized by everyone. And this was the part that was copied later, sometimes without recognition, and used by the authors going into the 16th century. But his poems, usually in the Reges meter, the urjuzas, or in the longer meter, the qasidas, are what preserves the part of his knowledge that was not just open, but accessible to everyone who since childhood, since at least being a teenager, sailed as an apprentice on the ships that crossed from Oman to the outer reaches of the Indian Ocean. Is this a good place to stop?
Yes, Dr. Telmachova, that was awesome. Thank you. And now we'll move to our second panelist, Dr. Charles Butterworth. His presentation title is Al-Farabi on Language, Logic, and Clear Thinking. He is Emeritus Professor of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is also a fellow at the Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Dr. Butterworth specializes in medieval Arabic and Islamic political philosophy. His publications include critical editions of the middle commentaries written by Averroes on Aristotle's logic, translations of books and treatises by Averroes, Al-Farabi, and Ar-Razi, and studies of different aspects of the political teaching of these philosophers and other thinkers in the Asian, medieval, and modern tradition of philosophy. And I'll turn it to Dr. Butterworth.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abir. And it's a great pleasure to be here this evening. It's a greater pleasure because for a number of minutes, I wondered if I was going to be able to conquer the genies behind the Zoom connection and actually appear, but that seems not to have worked. Dr. Marina, it's very good to see you. I have the vague impression that we have communicated in the past when you were at the American University of Kuwait. So it's very nice to see you either again or to see you at least virtually this time. I want to speak tonight a little bit about perhaps the most famous philosopher in the tradition of Arabic and Islamic philosophy. A man who inspires all of us attempting to learn Arabic because he was not a native-born speaker. Abu Nasir Al-Farabi, born in about 870 of the modern era, somewhere in an area beyond the Oxus River, from our perspective, east of the Oxus River, according to the biographers, either in Farab, Kazakhstan, or Faryab, Turkestan. While a youth, he moved about quite frequently, and he resided in Bukhara and also in Marv before he finally made his way to the capital of Arabic and Islamic civilization, Baghdad. While in Marv, he began to study Aristotelian logic with Nestorian Christian monks. That issue is itself worth saying a few words about. So I'll open a parenthesis for a moment. When the School of Philosophy in Alexandria closed at the end of the Alexandrian, the Ptolemaic rule, philosophy had to go into hiding. For some reason, it went into hiding under the garments of Christian prelates, and they carried the books or the scrolls of the philosophers with them as they moved east out of Alexandria, north up the Mediterranean, and then around Latakia in contemporary Syria, moved east again. When a group of them finally arrived in Bukhara and were able to start to study, the Christian church also found that it was no longer willing to countenance the study of philosophy. So philosophy had to go into hiding. And it's remarkable that it came to be known through this concatenation, this coming together of scholars of logic, and then from them finding new students such as this young man, Abu Nasir Al-Farabi, then blossomed forth again. So at any rate, Al-Farabi then moved on to Baghdad. When he arrived in Baghdad, he continues his studies with another Nestorian Christian by the name of Mata ibn Yunus. And also, most important, Arabic grammar with the very famous grammarian Abu Bakr ibn al-Sarraj. We don't know very much about Al-Farabi, but we know that sometime around 905, between 905 and 910 of the Common Era, he left Baghdad for a sojourn of about 8 years in Byzantium, in what we now know as Turkey. Perhaps he reached Constantinople or Istanbul, but he certainly reached Haran, and he sojourned there for a while, becoming more familiar with Greek learning. And then as far as the rest of his life goes, some 40 years later, about 942, political upheavals in Baghdad led him to step down from his position and go to Damascus. Then from Damascus to Aleppo, and then from Aleppo to Cairo. And more political upheavals prompted him to come back from Cairo to Damascus. And it was then at about 949, 950 that he died. We have good reason to believe that he died in Damascus. For anyone who's had the joy of reading Al-Farabi, to open one of his writings, any writing, is to be exposed to a plethora of delights that range from a succinct account of what constitutes happiness now and forever, a sharp definition of well-ordered religion, a sketch of order in the universe and the heavenly bodies, on to a crisp summary of how an awareness of all the sciences can be quickly attained. These treatises also raise fundamental questions, such as what it is that guides humans in their practical decisions. Is it judgment with all of its shortcomings, or is it certain knowledge? But even as these writings begin with titillating promises of great insight into such practical problems, all too often they close having presented us only with conundrums. They clearly identify the tension between a grasp of the way things are and the false pretense of having it. They do not resolve that tension, much less show the way to the desired alternatives. So Al-Farabi presents a world of delight to those who can understand the teachings of Plato and Aristotle. Even more, perhaps, what both of these thinkers mean by their riddles and indirect speech. We, his students, must learn to decipher both. Differently stated, how might we understand the claims of Plato's Socrates, especially the claim of ignorance, and especially the claim of ignorance about the most important things in the world, religion above all else? And how are we to put that together with the insistent inquisitiveness of Aristotle? Is this their way of dissimulating what they know? Or are they serious about their ultimate ignorance? Now, if the answer to those questions is yes, then how can Al-Farabi's claim that science has been completed by Aristotle be understood? And let me just offer you the following sketch. If we were to look at the writings of Al-Farabi, I think we would have to say that he provides at least two introductions to his teaching. The one that we know best, or the one that is best known, is in the attainment of happiness, followed by the philosophy of Plato and the philosophy of Aristotle. In that writing, he explains what it is that one needs to know in order to have happiness here and in the life after. Namely, theoretical knowledge, calculative virtue, practical virtue, and the practical arts. And then examining the life and teaching of Plato and the life and teaching of Aristotle, he shows how they tried to achieve these things. That's one way to have an introduction to Farabi's teaching. The other way is a very short little treatise entitled Indication to the Path of Happiness, Tanbih ala Sabil al-Sa'ada, just to show you how important happiness is for all of these quests. There is this shorter treatise, the Tanbih ala Sabil al-Sa'ada, and it's juxtaposed, as I just said, to the other treatise, Tahsil al-Sa'ada. Okay, so you can either be indicated how to get there, or you can actually attain it, says Al-Farabi. So both of these works open with the declaration that true happiness is the most important end of human striving. And the latter one, the Tanbih, the indication, then takes us through the importance of understanding how to rule our actions. In order to do that, we need to rule our passions. And in order to do that, we need to have mental discernment. You won't be surprised if I say, in order to do that, there's one more step. We need to understand how to think. So Al-Farabi says that the Tanbih, the indication to the path of happiness, stands as his first writing. And it then is followed by his writings on logic. And he tries to take us through, in a number of different commentaries, Aristotle's teachings of logic. And he does this for some reason by introducing us, first of all, in a summary manner to those teachings, and then comes back, having done that, and gives us a little bit fuller account of Aristotle's understanding of logic. And then, for a couple of books, gives a very detailed, almost word by word commentary on Aristotle's logical teaching. Clearly, understanding logic is very, very important. And let me just bring this to a conclusion by pointing to the following. In a book that is not that well known now, but was in Al-Farabi's day, a book called the Book of Letters, Kitab al-Huruf, or which could be translated as the Book of Particles, because a harf, the plural being huruf, a harf is either a letter or it's a part of speech, a letter like alif, be, jim, and so forth. And in that case, the Book of Letters, the Kitab al-Huruf, would be a commentary on a book by Aristotle, also known by its letters. I'm talking about the Metaphysics. The books of the Metaphysics are known as Aleph, Beta, Gamma, and so forth. Or he's really talking about the particles that we use in speech. We ask, Kam, how much? Keifa, how? Ain, where? Mata, when? And as we put these together and learn how to use them, we begin to think clearly about different things. I think the most important part of his Book of Letters is that he insists upon language being invented by human beings to solve human problems. We are responsible for what happens to us. But none of this can be said without remembering that there's also another dimension, a dimension that challenges us. And so Al-Farabi keeps that other dimension open. And as much as he promises about what is possible by human thought, he also shows that it is just out of our reach. I'm going to end there at the very place that I began. Al-Farabi promises us the world, shows us the way to achieve happiness in the world, and then reminds us that there's something lacking in what he has just taught us. We have to do the work ourselves. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Butterworth. And now we move to our third panelist, last but not least, Dr. Wasim Al-Rayes. His presentation title, Ibn Khaldun's use of ibar, morals, and Omran culture in his Muqaddimah. Dr. Rayes is Associate Professor of Political Theory and Constitutional Democracy at James Madison College at Michigan State University. He specializes in political philosophy with a focus on ancient Greek and medieval Islamic political thought, including the work of Plato, Aristotle, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Khaldun. He is now completing a book entitled Against Politics of Forever, Ibn Khaldun and the Science of Culture. And I turn it now to Dr. Rayes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this introduction and for this invitation. I'll begin first by a slight amendment of what I was planning to do. I was going to talk about Ibar and Omran in Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, but to keep it to 15 minutes, I will focus more on Ibar. And what I would like just to say by way of introduction is just something maybe in case people don't know who Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun was born in 1332 in Tunisia and died in 1406 in Egypt. He's known as a historian. He's best known for his Muqaddimah, that's his magnum opus. It's a about 1,200-page introduction to a study of history. That history is about 7-volume book that, in addition of giving the history of the world since, the known world since creation, the story of creation, until it focuses mostly, and its greatest contribution is the history of Northwest Africa, the history of the Berber, Amazigh, in people in Northwest Africa, and of course the Arabs in that region. That book is called Kitab al-Ibar, and is the focus of my talk today. And there are a couple of things that Ibn Khaldun does in his Muqaddimah. He introduces a new kind of science. He calls it the Science of Omran, which I translate as the science of culture, in order to help people verify historical reports, rationally verify historical reports, and also try and understand and verify for themselves, historical narratives in general. I will like to share my PowerPoint, because what I would like to do here is focus specifically on Ibn Khaldun's title to show you a couple of things about his brilliance as a writer, and also the richness of the Arabic language, which he employs very brilliantly. So I'll begin here. Can people see this?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So in this talk, I provide an illustration of Ibn Khaldun's mastery of the Arabic language through a discussion of the title of his major work on history, which is known in short as Kitab al-Ibar. Insofar as the title is expected to capture the substance of a work in a single word or a short phrase, it is potentially the most creative and symbolic part of a book. This is as true today as it was in ancient and medieval times. And yet otherwise creative medieval authors occasionally found the word or the phrase too brief to articulate their compositions. On such occasions, these authors opted to fashion a title out of a complete sentence, segmented with rhymed prose. This is the case with Ibn Khaldun's Kitab al-Ibar. The full title is Kitab al-Ibar wa Diwan al-Mubtada'i wal-Khabar fi Ayyam al-Arabi wal-Ajami wal-Barbar wa man asarahum min dawi sultan al-Akbar. A translation attempting the awkward task of balancing the title's literal and figurative meanings would be something like Book of Allusions and Register of the Subject and Predicate, regarding the days of the Arabs, the foreigners, and the Berbers, and of those of their contemporaries who possessed the greatest authority. I make two important points at the outset regarding my choice of translation. First, the phrase Kitab al-Ibar, which I translate as Book of Allusions, can also be translated as Book of Morals, Book of Lessons, or Book of Instructive Examples. Second, the phrase Diwan al-Mubtada'i wal-Khabar, which I translate as Register of the Subject and Predicate, can be rendered as Franz Rosenthal, the author of the only full English translation of Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, does, as archive of early and subsequent history, although the word history is not mentioned in the title, or as Muhsin Mahdi does, record of the origin and events. The reason I insist on the above inelegant translation is the need to preserve the contrast, clear in the original Arabic, between the apparent open-endedness of ibar as allusions versus the apparent conclusiveness of al-mubtada'i wal-khabar as the subject and predicate of a complete sentence. This contrast reinforces the need to reflect on the significance of characterizing the work in its totality, both as a muqaddimah and a history, as a combination of a book, kitab, and a register, diwan. The most striking thing about the full title of Kitab al-Ibar is the artistry of its composition. Without counting conjunctions, the title consists of a 14-word sentence sectioned by rhymed prose into 4 phrases, ending in Ibar, Khabar, Barbar, and Akbar, with each phrase longer than the one preceding by exactly 1 word, beginning with a 2-word phrase, Kitab al-Ibar, and ending with the 5-word phrase, وَمَنْ عَاصَرَهُمْ مِنْ ذَوِي السُّلْطَانِ الْأَكْبَرِ. This is an invitation designed to not only please the ear, but also to quietly appeal to an inner love of precision and harmony. But this attention to style of the title must not distract attention from its substance, its ability to communicate the work's content. To illustrate this point, I approach the title as one would the parsing of a grammatical sentence, taking as my cue the title's explicit reference to the subject and predicate, mubtada or khabar, of a nominal sentence. The title as a complete sentence is composed of 2 subjects whose predicate consists of 2 parts. The first subject is referred to as a book, kitab, and is given allusions, ibar, as a qualifier, while the second subject is referred to as a register, diwan, and is given subject and predicate, mubtada and wa khabar, as its parallel qualifier. The predicate of both the book and the register begins with the word ayyam, which literally means days, and it suggests, among other things, the idea of the passing of time. By the way, the idea of the passing of time is actually implicit in so much of the critical words that Ibn Khaldun uses in this book, from ibar to ayyam and umran. It's always reminding us of the passing of time. There are 2 qualitatively different sets of ayyam in the title. The first set concerns the times of the Arabs and the Berbers, 2 groups of people whose literal difference is metaphorically mitigated through contrast with the 3rd group identified as al-Ajam, or the foreigner. Typically, it's translated as Persian, but here it means foreigners, strangers. There is something about the title that brings actually the people of Northwest Africa, making them into one in some ways. They are different in some ways in language, but in the mode of being, there is a lot of similarity among those people by virtue of living in Northwest Africa. This history that Ibn Khaldun is going to explain. This is, by the way, it was a gap in the history of Islam that Ibn Khaldun wants to fill. The second concerns the times of people who possess the greatest political authority. وَمَنْ عَاصَرَهُمْ مِنْ ذَوِي السُّلْطَانِ الْأَكْبَرِ. For the purpose of shortness, I'm not going to go into those people for now, for this talk. There is something peculiar about the title of a history book that privileges in statement of content the word ayyam over that of history or tarikh. Why would Ibn Khaldun use ayyam instead of tarikh? Ayyam, immediately followed by al-Arab, ayyam al-Arab, recall a familiar genre of pre-Islamic oral history known as the battle days of the Arabs. Accordingly, Ibn Khaldun not only omits the use of the word history from the title, which is not in itself unusual in history books, but also appears to replace it with a technical phrase that privileges folklore over historical fact. The title, of course, stretches the conventional understanding of this type of oral history from the identification with Arab tradition to include that of other patrimonial groups, meaning the Berber. Similarly, it extends Ayyam's association with semi-nomadic culture to include also imperial power, which I'll talk about. I don't have to talk about here. But using Ayyam instead of history, the title underlines the fact that the material Ibn Khaldun examines and treats does not have the weight of an established and trustworthy records. He's writing a new thing about North Africa. In so doing, the title calls attention to the manner of treating and making sense of this material as the defining quality of the work. The manner and complexity of this treatment is captured by the conceptual division of the book into a book and a register. Understanding the functions of these two parts, Kitab and Diwan, with respect to their treatment of Ayyam, depends on how one defines the meaning of the word Ibar and the phrase Mubtada wal Khabar. A common, I feel like we are running out of time, but I'll go faster a little bit. A common way of translating Ibar as instructive examples suggests a concern with understanding the lessons, whatever these may be, of the history of the Arabs and Berbers. While following Rosenthal or Mahdi translation of Al-Mubtada'i wal-Khabar as archive, there is someone is muted.
Can you mute that person, Jasmine?
Okay.
Walid, can you mute yourself? Go ahead, Dr. Reyes.
While following, following Rosenthal or Mahdi translation of, well, I'll skip that part. I'll just go now. Okay. Ibar is the plural of Ibra, the verb root of which is Abara, meaning he crossed it, went across it, or passed over it from one side thereof to the other, namely a river and a valley. The root emphasizes movement from one location to another, while stressing the difficulty of such movement, as in the act of overcoming a barrier. This barrier and its hardship could be literal or figurative, physical or psychological. The literal and figurative connotation of the root abara combine to convey the idea of crossing over the most remarkable barrier of all, that between the world of the living and the world of the dead. He traveled or passed along the way, a road, as through he cuts it, he followed it, and so forth. With the inexorability of death, the act of living itself becomes the paradigmatic example of ubur, or crossing over, a symbol for the journey and its hardship. As a metaphor of life, the manner of living or crossing over is fundamental. Accordingly, several medieval lexicographers recall in their discussions of Ibar the following phrase: "Make us, O God, from among those who consider Ya'bur, this word, and not from among those who pass over Ya'bur, it." This prayer conveys two ways articulated by two words derived from Abara, through which the journey of life is taken. The supposedly ideal way, captured by Ya'bur, conveys a yearning for a life of consciousness, while the opposite way, captured by Ya'bur, conveys a life lacking in awareness. The prayer assumes knowledge of better and worse regarding the two modes of living and recognizing the pull of the unexamined life, which is positioned as the default human condition in want of divine transformation. But in the life of ignorance, but if the life of ignorance is a human being's original condition, how does one become conscious of such ignorance? Or put differently, how does one know what to pray for? An answer to this question is suggested by the very verb root that inspired the prayer's expressions of overlook, ya'bur, and consider, ya'bur. The literal meaning of the verb root, abara, as the transitioning from one side of, say, a river to another, allows for figurative expressions as divergent as those that communicate with the ease with which the transitory is disregarded, as well as those highlighting ways to understand its value beyond transiness. Thus, abara allows a cluster of meanings that emphasize the fact of overlooking, crossing, or passing over something. The verb root also allows a cluster of meanings that emphasize intellectual reflection, consideration, examination, meditation, and the like. Key in this last cluster is the idea of bridging the gap between what is known, what is given, and what is unknown, what needs to be inferred. And so, okay, and so to say of a man that he becomes aware, i'tabara, is to indicate that he took or regarded what he witnessed or saw or beheld as an indication or evidence of what was concealed from him. He compared what was unapparent with what is apparent, or they considered the essential properties of things and their modes of indication in order that by the consideration thereof, another thing of their kind might become known. I will just simply say the word ibar signals here more than just a study of history, but also a work of philosophy. And I'm happy if we have time to answer any question later on, but I will stop here.
Great, thank you, Dr. Reyes. And now we open the floor for questions. You can you can turn your camera on and ask a question, or turn your mic on and ask a question, or you can type it in the chat box. For the sake of time, maybe we can just do it verbally.
If we don't have questions for Dr. Wasim, may I ask one?
Of course, yes, that goes also to the panelists. You can ask each other any questions.
As a medievalist and cultural historian, I often regret that politicians are either unaware of culture and its strengths or willfully ignore it. Is there anything that you read in Ibn Khaldun that would explicitly refer to the meaning of culture for what he writes as state and tribal history?
Well, thank you very much for this question. A sufficient answer to your question would require much longer than I have, but the word culture that Ibn Khaldun uses is closer to the older word of culture in Latin, cultus, than it is to the way we understand it today. We understand culture that is able of becoming, used in several ways. The, Arabic culture, Islamic culture, Jewish culture, Western culture. Ibn Khaldun, when he talks about culture, he talks about it as in a universal terms. It's actually incapable of talking. He doesn't talk about Islamic culture. His culture is more universal human culture, and it has this divisions between civil and what we would call nomadic or semi-nomadic culture, which is what like the Arabs and the Berbers would be that type of culture as primary culture, and then as civil culture. It has a, both refers to human flourishing, and it include in it something spiritual. Like the idea of culture is not separated from, if you look at the root of the word and how it is used, from also religious reflection on the transience of life. The word umr, for example, comes from the same root, and umrah, as religion, as a kind of like umrah in going and doing the lesser hajj, is also comes from that same root. And Ibn Khaldun developed a whole science around this word. I am sure that this is just a very brief, I have a whole article about it, but I hope that this is helpful in some way.
Thank you, Dr. Reyes. Do we have any question for our panelists, or a question to all? Well, I have a question to Dr. Butterworth. My question is regarding translations of books and treaties by Nasir Al-Farabi and Al-Razi. I just wanted to know your process of translation, and how long it took you to translate this great work of, philosophers.
I don't know what you mean by the process of translation, but the answer to the second part of the question is simple: a lifetime. I am learning constantly about speech, my own, I hope, as well as that of others, in translating. And what I find so fascinating about trying to work through the writings of another person in a language different from my own is how much I learn, therefore, about my own unspoken but presupposed language. I'll take one example. I was about to say, we mean so much that we never make explicit, but hope is obvious in what we say. There's a word that is current in Arabic, ma'na, and one finds it very often, at least in the Arabic that I learned to speak, as a way of self-correction. Ani, I mean. And it sometimes becomes a default because people keep saying ani the way other people say ie or ah. It's just a grunt to give you a time to take more air and continue to speak. But I've noticed in the last month or so something quite fascinating. A scholar on the west coast of the United States, in California, wrote a book with the title Ma'ana. He does not, however, in the course of this book, consider that the term Ma'ana can be rendered as meaning. Instead, he wants it to be something like intentional significance. Lord, what would happen if you, every time you came across the word ma'na in an author, you tried to use the combination intentional significance? And then I read about a conference that's being held either now or in the next couple of days in Paris on the term ma'ana, in parentheses, intention. Okay, so ma'ana has the significance of intention, but think about it as you speak, as you use the word, what is it that you want to say when you use this? I think that this comes up with all of these different terms that we come across. And as I said at the very beginning of my presentation, what intrigues me the most about Al-Farabi, or perhaps inspires me the most, is that he came to Arabic as a non-Arab speaker, a non-Arabic speaker, and mastered the language.
Can I add one thing to your question, Dr. Mohsen, with respect to translation? Since I studied Dr. Butterworth's translations, like I've read his work closely. I think, one important philosophy about his translation, he can correct me if I'm being presumption, is that when you translate, especially books of philosophy, do not assume that you know more about what the author means than what the author says, and that there is a kind of respect. Like when you try and translate, sometimes you think, oh, he means, he means this. Like the sentence is not working very well, for example, or maybe he meant it. Like I'll make it clear by correcting what the author wanted, and that's not the philosophy. Like in that the approach that Dr. Butterworth takes to translation, and I'm really grateful for that, because it keeps it close to the text. And it's interesting, I know Arabic, I can have access to Al-Farabi, and I do, but I find it sometimes also helpful to look at translations sometimes, because, there is, even as an Arabic speaker, there is a difference in style. There is a difference in approach that Al-Farabi, someone like Al-Farabi, who's writing in the 10th century, would, than the Arabic that I'm used to. So I find it sometimes helpful to step back and come back through these kind of translations. So I'm not sure, but that's something that I appreciate about his work.
Thank you to both of you. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Can I ask?
If we do not, Dr. Abir, I would like to tag on something to Charles's note.
Sure.
I said a few words about the Arabic transmission of knowledge, but let me connect it back to Europe. One reason why we have French translation of the Hawiyya, for example, the only translation that I am aware of, is that the manuscripts of Kitab al-Fawaid and some other works of Ahmed Majid are in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and were first published in a 3-volume edition with a volume of commentaries included on Arabic navigational astronomy by French scholars. This is also the reason why, of course, other European scholars then availed themselves of the works. And also I have to really thank them for publishing the facsimile versions, so that the world was offered not only the foreign acknowledgement and interpretation of his heritage, but also access to the works that were at that time not published. I find that in some popular descriptions, the works of Ahmed Majid are referred to as published. Well, maybe that is correct in the sense that they were in manuscript, but they were certainly not published in French until the facsimile editions, first in Paris, secondly in St. Petersburg, then Leningrad. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Telmachova. Any question from the audience? All right, this is all the time we
Yes,
have.
I'm sorry. I did have one question. I know it sounds strange, but how long did it take this traveler to actually learn the Arabic language, or does anyone know?
How long what?
How long, the person that we're discussing, the one who traveled, the one who wrote all these things, how long did it take him to become familiar with the Arabic language?
Yeah, Ahmed bin Najid. How long did it take him to what?
To become comfortable where he was able to freely speak with people without having a difficulty.
I actually do not have the evidence that he was conversant in foreign languages, but he cites certain words. He certainly knows Swahili place names, and he knows, at least in Arabic and Persian, we presume usage, the names of places in Southeast Asia, a few in India. And so it is not so much that he is conversant in foreign languages as that he is aware of, first of all, local knowledge, and to an extent of classical knowledge. For instance, he cites about 10 authors who preceded him in formal geography, including Ptolemy, and he mentions the mountains of the moon, but I think that's the only place name from Ptolemy that he has. And that may be more to illustrate his learnedness and gain some prestige than to actually borrow from his forecomers, you know, the ancestors of his science. Those are only mentioned as the three Luyus of Al-Bahr and his own family.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I would like to thank our panelists, Dr. Barwer, Dr. Reis, and Dr. Telmachova. Thank you for great presentations. And I would like to thank our audience for attending our celebration of Arabic World Language Day. You have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Dr.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.